Welcome listeners to a new episode of the NKNews Podcast, and today I'm very pleased to have with us a special guest from Australia, Dr. Adrian Buzo, former Australian diplomat, currently lecturer in Korean at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and author of the brand new second edition of Politics and Leadership in North Korea, the Guerilla Dynasty. Welcome, Dr. Buzo, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.
How and when did you first come to Korea?
Well, I arrived here on the 8th of January 1972 as the newly appointed third secretary to the Australian Embassy.
What was South Korea like at that time?
Number one, well, it was classified as a hardship post by our Foreign Affairs Department, and I was the only one who wanted to come here. So that made it a bit easy. First impressions, it was putting all its chips on economic survival. Tremendous energy, a sense of incipient crisis, shall we say, not actual crisis.
During your first year here, North Korea and South Korea had their first real talks, I guess, since the Korean War, the Red Cross talks here in Seoul. Was that when you were here?
No, that preceded me. The 4th of July communique was 1972. But while I was here, there were a couple of meetings. I think there might have been one in Seoul and one in Pyongyang. And for the first year or so, there was an ongoing dialogue of sorts.
Okay, now, under what circumstances did the Australian government decide to open the first ever Australian embassy in Pyongyang?
Well, that goes back to the election of the Labour Party under Gough Whitlams in December 1972. Under the foreign policy adopted by the incoming government, influenced in a very strong part by a sizable number of influential socialist left cabinet members, the Labour Party viewed the Asian region very much in, let's call it a post-Cold War framework. Mm-hmm. China, North Vietnam and North Korea had been pretty well hardly done by and grossly misunderstood over the past 20 years because of Cold War politics. Now, well, I suppose you could say, so in my opinion, they got 2 out of 3 right, so that's not doing too badly. Mm-hmm. As a result of that, they lumped all 3 together. They moved immediately with incredible haste, virtually without preserving any bargaining positions, to normalize relations with China. Yep. And they moved very quickly with North Vietnam, as it was then. Yep. And they, in many ways, they wanted to lump North Korea into that, but they just kept on getting very, disturbing feedback, I suppose, and enormous amounts of pressure from the United States that, you can't sort of look at North Korea in the same way that you're looking at China and North Vietnam.
Okay. So when did the Australian embassy actually open in Pyongyang then?
In very late April, if my memory serves me right, about the 30th of April, 1975.
Were you part of those negotiations?
No, I wasn't.
Okay, but you were part of the opening of the first embassy?
Yes, I was, yes.
Tell us about that experience.
Basically, we were put up in what was called the Botonggang Hotel, which is way out on the outskirts of town.
Still open today.
Is it really? Good. It's been somewhat superseded. But in those days, it and I think the Cordia Hotel were about the only, I won't call them international hotels, right. But they had allocated a small embassy building to us. Mm-hmm. Basically, there were just embassy buildings left, right and centre. And there was, at the end, nestling under this huge electric transmission line pylon, yes. And next to it, just an empty, muddy field, was this rather small building that they had allocated to Australia.
Do you know if it had been used as an embassy or consular office before?
No, it was new.
Okay.
They sort of expected us simply to move into there because that was what was planned. But our ambassador, who was not a resident ambassador, he was the ambassador to China, was a bit more ambitious than that. And he said, this is far too small. And so sort of a tug of war ensued for about 4 or 5 months that saw us still.
This is while you were there in Pyongyang?
Okay. Yeah. And so that just meant we stayed in the hotel.
Botonggang, yeah.
And
worked from there?
We worked out of our rooms, yeah.
And so eventually what happened at the end of that tug of war then?
I think someone else pulled out. This was a time when North Korea was really pulling a lot of low-hanging fruit in the non-aligned movement. Several interesting countries were actually establishing embassies there, the Congo, Gabon, for example, and so on, and a raft of Middle Eastern countries. Somehow one of them must have pulled out because a larger and more suitable building, not under the pylons, came due, and for whatever reason they decided, the Australians can move in there.
What other countries, other than members of the Socialist Bloc and the non-aligned movement, had embassies there at the time in 1975?
The North Koreans had run up a series of very heavy foreign trade debts, with especially with the Nordic countries.
Right.
So the Finns had a trade commission there, or a trade office. The Swedes had an embassy, and their sole purpose, as far as I could see, was just to try to jemmy some money out of the North Koreans.
Were they successful?
No.
So the ambassador was non-resident. There was a chargé d'affaires.
Yep.
There was you as second secretary. Who else was there?
Oh, just an administrative second secretary as well.
And were you the only one who spoke Korean?
Well, we had an interpreter who was appointed to us. I'd come from about 15 months of language training in Seoul. I'd also majored in Japanese at Sydney University. So I had reasonable language skills. Yeah. And they were more reasonable than his, because he was clearly not up to the job. A lovely guy, and we got to know each other as well as one can in that sort of circumstance.
To what extent do you think he was working for the embassy, and to what extent was he working for the Korean authorities?
I think it's a bit of both.
Okay.
In ways that make it's something. Look, to be quite honest, I don't know whether he's still alive or not. All I can say is that he served his government well, and he served us well, and he was just a very, very nice guy.
Win-win for everybody. So what was everyday life in Pyongyang like as a Western diplomat?
As a Western diplomat, well, the first thing we used to say, because this was still the Mao era in Beijing, and every month we used to take the diplomatic, or every week we used to take the diplomatic mail out, get on the train, sometimes the plane.
From Pyongyang to Beijing.
From Pyongyang to Beijing. Yeah. And we quickly developed this sort of saying that Beijing was Paris compared with Pyongyang.
But that would have been a long train journey in those days, wouldn't
Yes, it was 22 hours.
Is that all? From Pyongyang to Beijing?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, well, that aside, what was Pyongyang like that?
Yeah.
Bare, bleak, like a tomb, like a mausoleum, basically. Huge, empty streets. Basically, I regarded it as part of my purpose in being there, to get to determine what I could and couldn't do, because what I noticed very quick was an awful lot of what you could call self-censorship. They just simply didn't want to be in North Korea, didn't like the North Koreans, and didn't venture out at all. But I just wanted to see what the limits were. So I tried to go shopping, and very quickly found that I was refused service in all but the diplomatic shops.
Okay, so diplomats were expected to do all their grocery and other personal shopping at the diplomatic shops?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So you were not expected to be buying anything from the North Korean economy?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Oh, wow.
Because you'd go the main department store, you needed coupons.
But weren't there at that time when you were there in the mid-70s, weren't there the special banknotes for people from non-socialist countries?
I never saw them.
Not at that time.
No,
Okay, that might have been later then. And you had this North Korean who worked at the embassy. You couldn't give him some money and say, could you go down the shops and get us some whatever?
Well, I guess we could have. It's just never occurred to me, because basically when you're living in a hotel, there are your meals.
Right.
We all got a big sort of food order of various types of things in from Hong Kong.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did you ever not live in the hotel during your time there?
No, always in the hotel.
And how long were you there for?
Total of 6 months. 6 months.
And that's when the embassy closed?
Yeah.
Okay, now could you tell us the circumstances under which the embassy was closed?
I think I've already said enough to give you the impression that our government's policy was not very well thought out, and it confused one country with another. Or
this is the post-Cold War mentality you're talking about.
Yes, yes, and somehow it thought that just as China had really come out. Remember, this is now we're into 75, and 3 or 4 years since the initial Kissinger trip. Those events. This confusion confused the North Koreans because Australia at the same time was making clear overtures to the non-aligned movement, for example. It had observer status at the 1975 non-aligned movement summit. And
North Korea was particularly active in the non-aligned movement, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Kim Ilsung would speak at some of the summits, like in Indonesia.
That was quite a while ago. The Bandung conference. That was very much back in the past. Now, Kim never went to any non-aligned deals. So there we had Australia with this rather confused and confusing policy. But after about 6 months, it came to a head over the United Nations. Now, people may not be aware, but every September, every autumn, the United Nations General Assembly meets, and it comprises various committees. And one of those committees is a political committee, which consists of all members. So committees are a misnomer, but it passes, or it considers, it deliberates, and it votes on a whole lot of resolutions, some of which are passed on to the main General Assembly and some of which just simply die on the vine. And so the Korea question at UNGA was a very big thing in the early 70s. The North Koreans were really pushing to have a pro-North resolution. Demanded the United States withdraw their troops from the South. And
something we're still talking about now. Indeed. Well, or I should say something North Korea is still demanding now.
Indeed.
Right.
And there was a pro-South one as well. There's just simply
sort of competing resolutions on the floor of the...
Yeah, and mutually contradictory as well.
Which Korea was a member of the United Nations?
None of them.
Okay, but they both wanted to be the only Korea.
Not really. That wasn't spelt out so much. Actually, the South Koreans in the very early 70s had moved to follow the West German position on East Germany. They wouldn't really get too upset if people wanted to recognize East Germany, as long as it was done with sort of in a friendly manner, in a manner friendly to the interests of West Germany.
Right.
And the South Koreans, I don't really think the South Korean government and its diplomatic corps gets half the credit they need for or they should receive for their diplomacy during this period. Very patient, very subtle, really maximizing their rather still very slender influence in regional affairs.
Okay, but we had these two competing resolutions. North Korea wanted support from Australia.
Yeah.
It didn't get it.
Yeah, that's right. It didn't it said, well, we'd like you to support us, but what we do ask is that you don't oppose us.
Okay.
Again, the government couldn't quite make up its mind, and it was confused about this, that, and the other. So confused that finally it really, the terms of the pro-North Korean resolution were just too much for the Australian government to support. I mean, they just weren't in the national interest, and they really were quite upsetting to the Americans. And the Americans, as everybody knows, they are the bedrock of our defence posture.
Right.
Essentially, our ambassador to the UN gave a speech that said we can't support this. We will vote for the South Korean resolution.
Ooh.
The interesting thing is that this didn't immediately trigger a withdrawal. Already, as I later found out, sometime about 3 or 4 weeks prior to this particular UNGA meeting, the South Korean chargé d'affaires in Canberra had told a neighbour and friend of his that he's going to miss Canberra.
Well, so you mean the North Korean chargé d'affaires, surely?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Sorry to say South. Sorry.
So the North Koreans knew they were leaving.
The North Koreans knew they were leaving once the actual terms once the outlines of Australia's fundamental policy on the Korean question at the UN became clear, and it took several months for this to become clear. But by mid-September, I'd say roughly 75 it was clear.
Right.
And the North Koreans did what the North Koreans do.
Which is, what, they told the Australians to shut up within 24 hours or something, was it?
48, actually, yeah.
Okay, 48 hours. So
Yes.
pack your bags,
Yep.
your embassy's closed,
Yep.
you're going back to Australia.
Yes.
And we're doing the same.
Well, they'd already pulled out.
Okay.
And the first we knew the North Koreans were pulling out was when a foreign affairs official was at Canberra airport on a completely different purpose.
Yes.
And he looked down the hall,
Yeah.
and there was this trail of luggage at the check-in counter,
Right.
with the North Koreans getting a flight to Sydney,
Yeah.
and paying excess baggage with a big wad of cash. The proverbials hit the fan at that stage, and then we were informed, I suppose, about 24 hours later. This occurred about 6 or 7 days before we were called in and said, essentially, look, we want you to leave. You've carried out a consistent campaign of spying and acts against the best interests of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Okay, so you were called into the foreign ministry. They gave you this message, and they said, on your way.
Yep.
Right. And by that stage, the North Korean diplomats from Canberra had already returned to Pyongyang, it sounds like.
Yeah, they were out.
Okay.
They were out.
There was also a funny story I remember hearing about the North Korean embassy vehicle in Canberra crashing and asking for help at the South Korean embassy without knowing it was the South Korean embassy.
It went like this. Something like 48 hours before they bugged out, the chargé d'affaires was going to a reception. Now, this reception happened to be at the top of a nice long stretch of road called Mugger Way in Canberra. So the bloke dropped his ambo, his chargé, and turned around, and this is the last time he would have to drive a Merc down a nice clear road, and so he gunned it. But unfortunately, at the bottom of the hill, there was a bit of a bend, and he rolled the car.
Oh, dear.
And it just so happened that the nearest residence to where he rolled the car was the residence of the South Korean ambassador. And so the ambassador had a big crash and came running out. The ambassador told me that he didn't have to pull him out of the car. The guy wasn't injured.
Right.
The guy just sort of got out and was dusting himself off, and the ambassador said, "Are you all right?" And the secretary took one look, and he recognized.
Yeah, he knew who it was.
And he just simply took off across the parkland. Yeah.
Leaving the car there.
Yeah.
Wow.
The next day, they went down to the Merc dealer, even though it was only 48 hours before they were bugging out, but they still had to get around. Right. So they went down to the Merc dealer, and there was a Merc in the showroom, and they said, we want to buy the Merc. We want that one in the window. We'll pay for it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that's already been promised.
Oh, dear.
It had been promised to the South Koreans.
Oh,
there we go. So there we go.
Well, let's move on to your research now. In 1999, or perhaps in early 2000, I bought the very first edition of your book, which at that time was under the title The Guerilla Dynasty. Tell us how that book came about.
Well, I'd actually struggled to avoid really becoming involved in North Korean studies, if you like. I had other preferences. But around about the mid-1990s, it sounds a bit glib, I know, but I had to do a PhD because of my overall position in academia.
Yep.
I'd reached a point where I just could not progress any further without a PhD.
Sure.
I tried to get good supervisors in my preferred areas, one of which was early Korean writing systems, but I just couldn't find anyone. But I could find a good supervisor for one on North Korean politics.
Okay.
I had already been writing for some years, especially for the Far Eastern Economic Review on North Korean affairs. So it did seem to me that I was fairly well read into the literature,
right,
and still had current information. So this seemed to me to be the best option.
Now, in a nutshell, what was that book about?
Well, in a nutshell, it tried to carry the narrative of Scalapino and Lee past 1972.
Now, at the end of last year, late 2017, you released a second edition under a new title. What's the new title of the book?
Oh, they just flipped it around. It's still the Guerilla Dynasty, but it's instead it's politics and leadership in North Korea, the Guerilla Dynasty. So I guess people will still refer to it as the Guerilla Dynasty.
Okay, all right. Then is it much revised and updated?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We know a hell of a lot more now, obviously. The full ramifications of the opening of the Soviet archives and a whole lot of other information has come to light.
Yeah, well, tell us some of the new things that you didn't know when you wrote your first book, or first edition, I should say, or impressions that you had in the first edition that needed to be corrected or removed.
No, there wasn't a great deal, because in many ways you got to flip it around and ask, well, look, has much changed in North Korea? That's obviously a question on which there are quite a few different points of view. We are still looking at the same complexion of government now under the grandson of Kim Il-sung.
Yes.
The structure, the policies, the fundamental strategic posture, the internal means of control and coercion are still identical. So really, very little has changed in North Korea. I think most people would agree if we apply that to the fundamentals.
What are those fundamentals? How does it work?
Yeah, governments are complex. You have a whole number of overlays of personality, interest, or special interest, etc. But let's leave that aside, because those specific factors in North Korea are not, in my mind, very significant. You have people who talk about bureaucratic competition.
So institutional bickering or that sort of thing?
Yeah, that sort of stuff. Well, they're just turf wars that you'll find inside Hyundai, or you'll find everywhere.
Every organisation.
And as far as I'm concerned, they're not really all that significant. Maybe for a fine point here or there, maybe a nuance here or there, but fundamentally, no. I do tend to go along with the hub and spoke model. If you want to simplify it even further, and it is a simplification, has the leader sitting there with 5 different coloured phones on his desk. He sits at the centre of a web. From that hub, he has around him a secretariat of people who are thoroughly loyal, whose loyalty has been vetted by a long career of service, by ties of blood, family, self-interest, you name it. It's proved to be extremely durable. Beyond that, then, you have the different overlapping channels of information, which enable him to talk to the military separately, to the parties separately, to various other areas of government. And of course, everybody is aware that that horizontal communication is an absolute no-no. Amongst the many forms of discipline that North Korea, within its government structure, this prohibition on horizontal communication.
You mean communication across different institutions and organisations?
That's right, and especially interest groups like the party. Someone can't. We don't know this for sure, but people at different levels of the party do not, in any routine fashion, have anything to do with counterparts in military or military intelligence or the bureaucracy and so on and so forth.
So all information flows up and down.
It flows up.
Right, okay. Information flows up and instructions flow down?
Instructions flow down based on an extremely attenuated stream, because what you also had with Kim Il-sung was a personality, an extraordinarily bullying type temperament who simply wanted to hear what he wanted to hear. Anyone who essentially pushed unfavourable information up the line was really asking for trouble. This habit of self-censorship was dinned into the entire bureaucracy over a period of decades. And it still existed in the 1990s. And one of the tragedies of the famine was simply that there was just no means of actually getting accurate information, or no one could take the responsibility for getting accurate information to the leadership in time. And in turn, of course, you had the other problem, which was the leadership itself was not concerned with alleviating famine as a policy end in itself. You
mentioned before that you don't see organisational turf wars in North Korea as being of any great significance. So you would reject then the idea that North Korea is run by competing factions. There have been authors in the last decade or so who have suggested that there's hawks and there's doves and there's different factions, and sometimes the party's in ascendancy, sometimes the military's in ascendancy, and you would say, no, it's down to the leader?
Oh, absolutely. All these things are matters of evidence. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, posits, the hawk and dove, posits and narratives, especially the narrative that in countries like that you have hawks and doves, or everywhere you have hawks and doves, that becomes a very predominant, or that just becomes an easy and, to my mind, intellectually lazy narrative. Mm-hmm. You have to have some evidence. I mean, really, that's all it gets down to. And I just can't see it.
Well, I guess people would point to North Korea sometimes reaching out with overtures and sometimes doing something provocative. Therefore, it may be evidence of hawkish and dovish factions at work.
Well, yes, but then, of course, you'd have to come along and say what's tactical and what's strategic. I mean, all the stuff that's gone on in Pyongyang is highly tactical. The severe consistency of this policy going back over decades, I think, is something that really does just leap out at you. They're prisoners of history by now. The people who run the country are the dregs of what was a great socialist vision for the future of North Korea in 1945. Unfortunately, the stewardship of that vision fell into the hands, first of all, of the Stalinist occupation, and then Kim Il-sung, who saw in this sort of the Stalinist system just exactly what he needed in order to meet multiple objectives. So beginning with his own survival, it played to his own strengths. It appeared in its marshalling of all the power of North Korea to be a viable way through to completing the task of reunification. Mm-hmm. Now, the first Korean War, well, that was his effort.
Yes, to reunify the country.
To reunify the country, and the failure of the Korean War to achieve that objective. I think to most, well, certainly to the Chinese and the Soviets, that ended the issue. They accepted quite overtly. They accepted that Korea would just have to remain divided. Mm-hmm. But that was not something that Kim Il-sung could ever accept. And of course, you have to factor in personality things. You know, having once nearly come to victory. He rededicated the country to another go, basically. So
today, under Kim Jong-un, do you think that the strategy is still the same, i.e. unification of the Korean Peninsula, or is it system survival?
System survival, and take advantage of what you can.
Okay.
And it's not too different. Whether you're seeking your own survival or whether you're seeking reunification, you're still going to be wedded to several sort of overarching positions. One is that you want to weaken wherever possible the US footprint in Northeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And every time they fly a rocket over Japan, they believe, and well, it's not an unreasonable belief, that this is weakening the Japanese faith in the United States' ability to protect them. The North Koreans believe fundamentally that time is on their side and history is on their side, and basically they need to stay the course, and that eventually they will prevail, because sooner or later the Americans have to go home, because that was the Vietnamese position too.
So you believe that the North Koreans believe that ultimately the Americans will leave?
Not just the North Koreans, I think almost everybody sees that in many ways, especially the United States presence in South Korea, mm-hmm. it was founded on an anomaly. Mm-hmm. They never intended to get into the Korean Peninsula. Once there, once again, the Americans are to some extent prisoners of history as well. Mm. They can't get out. They'd like to go home as well, I'm sure. That's the first sort of key thing. They want to weaken the United States strategic presence in Northeast Asia, and also of distaste, dislike, disdain for the South. And they seek to undermine and humiliate the South every chance they get. So you're not going to see too much of a difference, whether it's they're seeking just survival on their own terms. And we all know that when you seek survival on your own terms and when you start to develop weaponry to achieve that or to pursue that objective, we all know it's open-ended, because the definition of security itself is almost an open-ended definition. So where are the North Koreans going to stop? That's fairly clear. That's the fundamental question that the Americans and the South Koreans and the Japanese are asking themselves. And there's no sign of any finite position where the North Koreans will say, okay, we've achieved what we want to achieve, now we'll talk, etc.
Going back to the Kim dynasty or dynasty, well before Kim Il-sung died in 1994, preparations were made for Kim Jong Il to take over. He was already very much in control of many of the reins of power before his father died. That wasn't the case with Kim Jong-un. Is the current system any weaker under Kim Jong-un without that period of takeover, of handover, or is he doing very well?
I can't see that it made much difference, to be quite honest. To me, it's got to be some kind of factor, but it hasn't been a factor. I mean, he's now been in power now for 7 years. Domestically, again, despite these ridiculous international media images of Caligula on the Taedong, this really is very much a post-terror regime, if you like. Under Kim Il-sung, the terror was palpable, and I can certainly tell you that it was when I was there in 1975.
Terror that he might do away with people?
The fear that people felt on a day-by-day basis, their unwillingness to have any contact. I'd stand at a bus stop and just ask, excuse me, is the next bus going downtown? Just as a gambit, I would get this startled look and a very hurried "neh," and then a very quick 2-meter jump away from me. And so it went. And I could give you many examples of that kind of thing. Kim Il-sung was, to call him a tyrant, you'd have to call him a tyrant's tyrant. It was really a very difficult, a very tough dictatorship.
Okay, so you would call Kim Jong-un a post-terror.
Yes. Now, then you move forward to Kim Jong Il, who I would call the great consolidator in many ways. In the broader scheme, in the broader range of things, when history books are written decades from now, I think people will have a much enhanced opinion of Kim Jong Il. He was an extremely clever operator. He was a dictator's dictator in many ways. Kim Il-sung did have very good succession plans, but they are absolutely the exception rather than the rule. Great dictators, of course, either don't have succession plans, or if they do, they're pretty wacky ones. So Kim Jong-il, he was 69, I think, when he died. He should have been making plans before then, but for whatever reason, he didn't. And so, he jumped over his two sons, and it's very clear why he jumped. They were just not serious-minded people at all. And he jumped over to his third son, and as far as I can see, if you wanted somebody to run the system or to preside over the system, he chose very well. Because now 7 years on, as I said, the one sort of egregious casualty was Jang Song-tek. Quite a few people around him, also people affiliated with Jang, also bit the dust.
Also the brother that was one of the first brother to be skipped over, who was killed at the Kuala Lumpur airport last year.
The extent to which that really is intrinsic to a power struggle in Pyongyang is another matter. The motivations, and so it's a murky thing.
It may not have been a power struggle, but I'm just thinking of it as perhaps a form of a terror of his own, that Kim Jong-un is not averse to going back to his grandfather's methods of putting the fear of Kim back into the populace.
Well, you and I know we have discussed this in other forums,
Yes.
but I would say there's no pattern there. In fact, in many ways, though, especially what I found is the more you analyze the military changes at the very top of the military between 2012 and let's say up to the Party Congress to 16, there were quite cogent reasons why people were replaced, and very, very few of them were purged, remarkably few of them.
So if you were to write a sort of an interim report card for Kim Jong-un's leadership at this stage, what grade would you give him and what comments would you make?
I don't know nearly enough. I think it would be very presumptuous. All I can say is that from the outside, there seems to be overall a very steady system in operation. I can't even say there's a steady hand on the tiller because I don't know to what extent his hand's on the tiller. Kim Jong Il gathered around him, obviously, a strong secretariat, and that secretariat, by and large, with the exception, obviously, of Jang Song-tek, as far as we know, has kind of moved on over into the Kim Jong-un era. And I think you can really get hung up badly by playing the man and not the system. Overall, you do need to see the system and the very fractional ways in which the personality of the person in charge of the system influences events.
But how do we square that with what we were talking about earlier, that it's the man at the top with the 5 phones, the hub and spoke? If the personality of Kim Jong-un is not that important, or if we're not even sure if his hand is on the tiller, then how can we say he's the man at the center of the spokes?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing because essentially what he says into the 5 telephones has already in many ways been determined, both consciously and unconsciously, by his secretariat. And let's just say let's call it the objective situation in the country and the fundamental policies that the regime is following.
Let me ask you a final question. Imagine in 10 years or so, you come to update and revise your book for a 3rd edition, Politics and Leadership in North Korea. What are some possible futures you can envisage at that time on the Korean Peninsula?
I think prediction is voluntary folly here. In the old days, you used to think, this burgeoning wealth among the Pyongyang elite, that's going to help integrate them more into the international system at some stage. To me, I think it's equally possible to argue the exact opposite, that they have all they need. They don't need the outside world. Their world of privilege and luxury is won at the price of 70% of the population malnourished and still 100,000, 150,000 plus in the gulags. They just have no incentive to change. The Chinese don't have a huge incentive to move any further than they already have. This is one of the obviously big sort of misapprehensions that you can talk about a Chinese policy towards North Korea. North Korea essentially makes clear all the fault lines that you find within the Chinese government in terms of military, bureaucracy, and so on. They all have different interests. The trade-off is that we're going to do so much and no more. If I had to predict 10 years from now, if I said more of the same, I could easily be proven wrong.
But you wouldn't be surprised, right?
I would absolutely not be surprised whatsoever.
If the regime was doing basically the same as today, 10 years from now. Yeah.
Exactly.
And if not, what would be the sort of wildest scenario you could imagine?
The wildest is that somebody loses their nerve. Somebody important
inside North Korea or
inside North Korea. Now, basically, we've been able to hold the peace. We of the international order,
right.
Have been able to hold the peace in Korea since 1953. We've been extremely good at doing this, and that's not just simply due to the Americans or to the outside force. The American military, I think, by the way, has behaved on the whole extremely wisely in this active theatre of war. Let's remember the North Koreans have also their their kind, especially under Kim Jong Il, a big difference between Kim Il-sung, who was a provocateur, Kim Jong Il, who had a much more measured tactical view of using force, used it quite scientifically in many ways. I think Trump is going to be held in place by the U.S. military. I don't think they'll allow him to do anything crazy. The South Koreans are ready to sort of drift again into a kind of a sunshine policy, Mark II. That doesn't really do any harm, but it doesn't do much good. People, I think, neglect all the positives that are going for North Korea. The sum of those positives, Chinese ambivalence, South Korean, well, it's a form of ambivalence, I suppose. The fact that whether the Americans like it or not, their strategic position in North Asia is weakening because of the resurgence of China, etc. So, yeah, it's more of the same, but so there's no incentive within North Korea, barring something completely unexpected. A shootout in the palace or perhaps just a developing feeling amongst important people, hey, we should and we can find a place for ourselves in the international order. It can work. And we do need to remember that the North Koreans are heirs to a centuries-old tradition of high culture. One of these days, that will prove to be one of the most significant influences on their future.
Well, let's end on that hopeful note then. Thank you very much, Dr. Adrian Buzo.
My pleasure.